Okay, so thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on the CPSG principles of species conservation planning. And it's the first chance we've had to air them, although CPSG, having been working in this space for the last 4 decades, has been definitely has these principles ingrained in it throughout this time. But this is the first time we've started to sort of think about how do we put shape to them, and what have been in our experience useful values to keep in mind, whatever process you use. So in this webinar, I want to introduce you to CPSG principles of species conservation planning. But what I'd like to do is have a chance, even though there are a number of us, to interact a little bit more over what we think one should care about when you're designing a planning process. So we're going to start off, I'm going to present some of these results, then we're going to go into a breakout room for a short while, and then we'll come back together and I'll go through a presentation, a short presentation, and then there'll be a few minutes for questions at the end as well. So in this survey that I sent out before, when the early questions were really to get a sense around diversity of the people that were coming to the webinar in terms of your experience of species conservation planning. And around about half of you didn't feel you had any experience in it, and the rest of you did, either as participants or as designing planning processes and facilitating them. In terms of what tools and processes you use, some people are using decision making, others are using CPSG tools, others are using open standards, and there are a range of them out there that promote a way of doing conservation planning, whether it's for species or something else. But the question that's most interesting, for me anyway, is this last one, around the extent to which you agree with these statements. And some of them there was a very strong agreement on. For example, that there's obviously a sense within a group that sitting alone at your desk writing a plan is probably not the best way to get a plan produced that is then effectively implemented. And I mean, obviously, if you do have enough sufficient power and influence and resources, maybe that's possible. But for most of us, we do rely on including others in a plan. And that seemed to be reflect your experiences. Where there is a bit more diversity, and this is something that we can perhaps revisit during the discussion that you'll have in the breakout rooms, is the extent to which you, as the person who cares about the species or whatever you're focusing on, are the best person to facilitate the process. And there's obviously a bit of a mixed view here around whether or not that is right. I think we often find ourselves in the situation where we might need to be the one because somebody's got to move forward because we're concerned about what's happening. And so you end up in the position where you might be facilitating it. But I'll just leave it as a question mark at the moment over as to whether or not you as the person who cares most should be the one who's best placed to facilitate that process. There's obviously a strong sense that we should take time to identify relevant stakeholders, and that there isn't one approach, whether it's CPSG, open standards, structured decision-making, whatever it might be. Each of these approaches has their value, and really it's about tailoring the approach to the context that you're concerned with. Where there's again some diversity, which we can revisit later, is this idea around species experts. And maybe this partly reflects ambiguity over what we mean by an expert. If we're imagining here that we're talking about professionally trained people who understand the species, then maybe there would be one view. If we're saying, well, if you know anything about the species, then you should be the ones that are involved in developing it. And I'm not sure what your interpretation of the question was. From my perspective, I would definitely veer more towards the latter, where anybody who has has something to contribute in terms of information about the species, about the context it's living in, about the people it might be living with, and obviously linked to an understanding of the wider system in which it lives, political, economic, etc., then they are best placed to lead on the development of the plan. But where one leaves the planning to professional experts, as it were, scientists, and to sort of capture it very briefly, then I think there are limitations around that. But again, maybe that's something we can talk about later. And lastly, strong agreement around the need to share the plans and openness to flexing the planning process once it has been designed. Now, these questions do tie in with the tools of species conservation planning from CPSG's perspective. And it will be interesting to see what other discussions come up within your group when you start digging into this further. I just want to stop sharing the screen just now and come back to you. Does anybody have, before we go into a breakout group, does anybody have any any observations they'd like to make on what I ran through just now? And if you do, you can write it in the chat, or you can turn your mic on, because there are few of us there are few enough of us that we can actually talk. Then I'll presume that made sense. What I would like to do then is to have a chance to talk about it a bit more. And I'm actually just wondering, I think we will go into breakout rooms, even though they're relatively, there's a reasonable number of us, because I'd like you all to get a chance to talk it through. But I'd like, with those answers in mind, I'd like you to, when we go into, I'll put you into 2 breakout rooms, and you're just going to have 10 minutes to talk about what should we care most about when we are designing a planning process. Now, we CPSG care most about species. You might have other particular foci, and that's fine. But whatever it is you care about, whatever it is you're going to plan for, in thinking about the design of the planning process, what do you feel are the most important things to consider? And when you're in the breakout rooms, you can chat around that question and try and think of sort of some keywords that come out to you from that discussion that might relate to values that should underpin whatever process that we might use. Does that make sense to everybody before I put you into breakout rooms? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to leave you for 10 minutes, and then you'll be brought back in. You'll get a 60-second countdown. I'm just going to see where the breakout rooms are. So I'm just giving you a bit more time. All right, so you're going to automatically move into. I was going to put you all into one room, which is not very helpful. So I'm going to. Sorry, I want to assign automatically. Oh, where does it allow you to assign automatically? Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to put a few of you, I'm just putting you into, splitting you between the 2 rooms. All right. So I'm going to open the rooms just now, and you've got about 10 minutes to just have a talk about that, the values underpinning species conservation planning process that you might adopt. I'll see you shortly. Cool. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen just now so we can have a look at the results of this survey, this question. So this is the question we're considering. Oh, actually, I need to come back from that. Okay, let me just go back in. So there's something out in there, and sustainability obviously could be thinking about the sustainability of the population, of the project, of people, practices, sustainability of processes, stakeholders coming out strongly there. Just wait a short while longer. And stakeholders is, oh, well, typical, now it's changing. The theme of stakeholders is something that perhaps unsurprisingly, but it's great to see it coming out as being an important element. But it's also obviously a complicating element. It's what makes it that much more difficult to develop these plans when we're starting to involve people who have got different values, different backgrounds, speaking different languages, whatever it might be. Yet most of the time we do not have neither the power nor the resources to be able to put any species conservation plan into practice alone. And arguably there is there's a moral aspect to it as well, that one should at the very least do no harm. And when identifying stakeholders, you might, as well as looking at the power, the relative power that they may possess, you're also thinking about what might be the impact of the project, of the plan, on their lives and what they care about. So stakeholders, funding, long-term viability, resources are coming out strongly there. Interesting, actually, that well, actually, if we just turn to the mics now, rather than me just saying what's interesting, do you want to, any comments that come out, any thoughts that come out when you look at some of these themes that are emerging, in terms of whether it makes sense to you, whether you think anything is missing? And please just turn on your mic and start talking, because I think there's a few of us so we can manage that. Michael, you're unmuted just now. Did you want to make any comments about what some of those themes are that are emerging?
I was just looking at funding.
It's trying to consider whether some people feel very strongly that you need to have the funding in place before you actually start thinking about developing a plan, and others will use the plan to get the funding. I don't know whether there is a kind of right or wrong way of doing it, but obviously you're needing to consider whether or not you're going to have the resources. I know as far as CPSG is concerned, many of our plans, and Eugenia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, for many of our plans, the resources are definitely not explicitly known in advance of the plan. That we hope that through the process of unifying stakeholders around a common purpose and a set of actions that they feel make sense and will achieve what they want to, that will actually catalyze resources to be made available. Don?
It depends on what stage of a particular process or project you're in for a lot of your answers as to which of these factors is most important, obviously.
So if you are right near the beginning of the process and you decided, you know, we've got this thing here we care about, we need to do something about it. What would you say are there elements that stand out to you as being more critical at that stage than at a later stage?
Yeah, sure.
Until you get funding, you know, as they say, money talks. So it's always a good first step. It doesn't hurt.
Absolutely, and I think if you can secure that in advance, then that's great. I suppose one challenge is you may not know at this point what it is you want to do about it. What we do know from both from experience and also through published work is that there is a tendency for us as a species to jump very quickly to actions, to make assumptions about what it is that needs to be put in place that will save the species. And we actually get wedded to particular strategies far too early on in the process, partly because that might be an area that we care about or we feel has been undervalued before, or we work in that area, or we might genuinely feel it's going to make the difference. And so judging at what point we can actually know what it's going to cost us. Obviously, one can make a rough idea, but knowing what it is you're actually going to do, definitely from my perspective, and Eugenia, you correct me if you think we do it differently elsewhere in CPSG, that you're often reining people back from making those decisions. You're trying to hold people back and get them to think much more carefully about what's going on, where do we need to target our efforts, and in the process, trying to help people to reach common sense of common agreement around what needs to go on. If one allows the process to run through too quickly, not only can you make premature decisions, but you can also, i.e. not necessarily good decisions, but you also can sacrifice some of that agreement, buy-in to the actions being implemented. And I would argue, although I think this is probably a hypothesis that needs to be tested, that the reason why many plans sit on shelves and are not put into practice is not because they're not good plans, i.e. not thought about carefully, but because the process didn't ensure sufficient buy-in and support from the relevant stakeholders for them to make it a priority beyond it being a doorstop. And I think this need to get agreement, even if that involves some sort of, that involve complexity and some tensions, is critical if what we want to do is ultimately see change in the species. Eugenia, you've got your mic off. Sorry,
did you say my name? I missed it.
Oh, sorry, I've got too few people on the screen. Go for it.
Well, I just wanted to jump in. I think a base level of funding for the positions of the people that want to do the planning has to be considered, because I'm relatively new in the world of long-term planning because I've had such short contracts and I've been jumping. And so what amount of time in a position is enough to start proper planning when you know that your contract's going to end and there isn't going to be funding to keep going? And trying to balance that has been difficult for me in the past, but I'm really looking forward to actually planning year to year instead of a few months ahead.
A few months ahead, absolutely, yeah, so that fits into, in my mind, it fits into the box of governance and thinking about how are we going to oversee the implementation of the project or the plan that we are developing, and definitely what is clear is that where you lack a designated point person, whether they are a central point for communication or they are the project manager, they could perform a variety of roles, but where there's a lack of a point person that sees it, that it has that responsibility to move things forward once the plan is produced, then plans often flounder. So that makes sense. You got that, that having those resources in place to be able to get somebody there. But obviously, how that person then connects to others within the group, and how decision making is going to be made, what communication channels need to be in place as well, all feeds into the ability of those people involved to do their job effectively. And that's an aspect that is, I think, going to become increasingly important within the plans that we develop to get right around governance. Judy, I can see you've got your hand up, and we'll take your question and I'll go to the presentation.
Just a very quick comment. I think a word that is missing here, and perhaps it's implicit, is really effective communication. So carefully planned, carefully thought out communication that involves listening as well as talking. I think that's something that we should also care about. So just a point that we could add to our list of important words.
Absolutely. And I wonder if that actually, we've got this point of capacity in there, which could be seen as something that we lack and we need to gain, or it could be seen as one of the things you're trying to achieve through the planning process. And what we often find is that through working with people from in the pre-planning stage through the development of the plan to the post-planning production of the report or the plan and getting that shared and used, that there's often a change that occurs with people who've not been through that sort of process before. And when you then revisit planning for some other species, they are in a different place. Their understanding of the process and particular skills such as around asking clarifying questions, checking for understanding before you make your particular point. Those sort of skills linked to listening are ones that you often see being cultivated as people go through this sort of participatory process. So thank you very much for that. It'll be interesting now to see how much what we're talking about here resonates with the 7 principles that I want to introduce you to. So let me just, oops. To that. So can I check, Riley, can I check you can see my screen there though with a camera in and a PowerPoint? Great, cool. So what I want to do now is just run through these 7 principles to species conservation planning, which I think probably could be largely applied to planning in general, although it hasn't been verified at all. And the starting point is that what we're dealing with, if we recognize that stakeholders are important, that we can't just do this alone, then we are moving from the complicated. It would be complicated to develop a translocation program for a species and actually move things successfully from one place to another. But there is known experience, there's steps that you can take, skills that can be applied to achieve that task. What we work in when we're getting involved in designing the plans for such processes is complexity. And at this point, we are moving far from certainty, and we may well, at the starting point, have relatively low levels of agreement around what should happen. There's often more questions than answers. We know relatively little about the things we care about. We might be trying to gather and garner that the experience and knowledge that exists, but there still be big question marks. And right at the beginning, when you've got diversity of stakeholders, there are going to be a diversity of values, of perspectives on what should or should not happen. This is the space that we sit in with species conservation planning, and it is why we need to think quite carefully about how we design the process. Actually, just as an aside, we might argue that we're currently in the realms of anarchy, or chaos, given the current situation, and definitely my experience of using Zoom in the last hour made me feel that I was working in that space. So CPSG, the Conservation Planning Specialist Group, was the Conservation Breeding Specialist Group, has been working for the last 40 years in the domain of species conservation planning, helping others to develop plans for threatened species. And what we found through our experience is that there are some things that seem to work really well, that bringing people together, maybe increasingly virtually, but if we can in person, can provide an important catalyst when it's embedded in the right sort of process to achieve change, whether that's for the Tasmanian devil or other species that we might work with. And when we distill it down to not to what do you do to develop a plan, but what should you consider, what you should concern yourself with when you're developing a plan. For us, there seem to be 7 principles that stand out. And the first of which is a no-brainer. It almost goes without saying, but clearly what you're trying to do is develop a plan that results in implementation, effective implementation, and hopefully change in the species or the population. What that means is that there is no single process, there's no single way of planning that is going to be right in all situations. Do I need to include decision trees? Must I do goals at this point or a later point? Do stakeholders need to develop a vision? The answer to these questions is no. There are patterns that will emerge, but there is no single formula that you can cut and paste and apply to a new situation and say, these are the steps we're going to go through, these are the tools we're going to use, this is the sort of plan we're going to produce, and this will be the result, because the complexity is too great for that. So recognize that that you're going to be tailoring the process to suit the context in which you're working. The second principle is around inclusive participation. And a number of people have mentioned stakeholders as being important. And it's, in our experience, it's about not just including the right people, but thinking about how their voices are heard. So how do we make sure that space is given for those people that both have power and those people that are going to be impacted by any plan, in order so that they can input into the planning process and have a significant role in decision making around that process. Now, each situation will be different. In some contexts, then it may have already been decided what decision-making powers that group will have that are designing the plan. But what we should be doing is making sure that there is equality within that group around what they're able to influence. And an illustration about how we ensure that voices are heard actually comes from Eugenia's work and her colleague Fabiana in CPSG Brazil, where they're currently working with the sand tiger sharks. And Eugenia, apologies if I get this wrong, but it's become very clearly important to make sure fishers' voices are heard in the process. But because of the current situation, that they're not able to have an in-person workshop. And so how do we ensure that their voices are heard appropriately within the planning process, when technology may well be a barrier to their inclusion? So Eugenia and a colleague have been thinking about, or been working on and using simple surveys, doing video interviews, and finding other ways to actually capture the information from the fishers to be able to include their voice in the planning process. Now, this is not perfect. In terms of equality, you'd want to have everybody there in the same space. But sometimes we have to work extra hard to work out how we're going to ensure everybody gets a chance to have their say, that their voices are valued within the planning process. The third principle is around the use around information and the use of sound science, using the best available information. And this is why in the preparatory stage, it can take many months before you actually get to bring people together for any planning process, because one needs to spend time gathering the information. An illustration of this is the use of population viability analyses. which are not used in all workshops, but it does allow for for evaluation of different alternative courses of action. For example, here with the Colorado pike minnow, where they were looking at different strategies and how they might impact the recovery rates of the population. Now, as I mentioned, it doesn't matter. We don't say you have to use PVA as part of the principle. But the most important thing is that you do value the information and think about how we gather that information. It might be in advance of the workshop. It might be during the workshop. An illustration from a number of years ago was with the tree kangaroos in Papua New Guinea, where some of the most valuable information came from the villages that were living close alongside the tree kangaroos, and some of them actually just brought a bag of leaves that they had seen the tree kangaroos eating, and that information was stuff that the scientists didn't have access to because they don't have a chance to spend that much time in contact with the animals and studying them. But because they lived alongside the species, they had hugely valuable information that they could input into the planning process to ensure that the plan was well thought through. So the use of sound science is that third principle underpinning any process that you use. The fourth comes back to one of the points we raised before around good design and neutral facilitation. Now, there are going to be situations in which there'll be lots of situations in which you could be involved in designing the process, even if you care about the species. And the diagram at the bottom is an illustration of a possible process you might go through of divergent thinking, where people are encouraged to generate information, and then convergence, where they decide what information is most important, and they might draft a vision, they might prioritize threats, they might develop goals, etc., etc. And you can be involved in the design of the process to get to the plan that you're looking for. But where it comes to facilitating the process, particularly where where trust levels might be low, where complexity is high and uncertainty is high, it may well not be appropriate for you as the species champion to be the most effective person to facilitate that process. The reason is that it's not just about how you perceive yourself, but also how others are going to perceive you. And if there's any chance at all that they may not, that they may question whether you are neutral in terms of what sort of plan comes out the end, what sort of strategies are identified, etc., then that can compromise the whole process. Which means you may have to, if you want to have the best chance to get the most effective plan as far as we're concerned, you may be reaching out to others around you to see if they can come in and take a lead on facilitation. The other, and the point in terms of facilitation, it's enabling others to be able to do their best thinking and to reach high levels of agreement in the outcome. The other reason why you may not want to be the facilitator is that being facilitator and participant, knowledge, being a knowledge expert, are difficult roles to put together. And so it's much better to free yourself up to be a content person, to give information to the process, and to influence what is a priority through being a participant, and leave the facilitation to somebody else. So good design and neutral facilitation, one of the principles underpinning effective planning. And you want to try and reach decisions through consensus. This is about developing agreement. So it's not about compromise, but it's about reaching agreement where people can live with the results. It may be that they were wedded to another course of action, but as long as the process is designed in a way that allows them to accept they've had a chance to input, there's an alternative view that has evidence behind it, and they've been encouraged to listen to other views, then you're hopefully trying to move people to a point where they can accept an alternative that they may not have considered before. So designing the process to reach consensus is the fifth principle 6 is around what you do when you've actually finalized the report, if it was a workshop, or the final plan, if there's some tailoring that needs to happen. And an illustration of how important it can be was something that happened recently for me, where we were doing some planning for Azorian invertebrates, and there were 40 odd species of invertebrates in one of the islands in the Azores that we were planning for. And at the end of the workshop, we contacted a number of the ministers, one of whom, just to give them an update, and one of whom happened to be doing their tour of the islands and wanted to have good things to talk about as he made his public addresses. And giving him a snapshot of what happened in the workshop resulted in him standing up and making a public proclamation about support for the project, about going for funding to be able to support the work, and a sort of an official stamp to the plan before it was even actually finalized. Alongside that, protected area managers were made aware of the plan, and they just by chance again happened to be in the process of redesigning the protected area. And as a consequence of the results of the workshop, they were able to tweak the designs so that it accommodated the priority habitats for these species. Now, these are just sort of serendipitous opportunities that happen, chance effects from sharing the results as quickly as we could. But there are, I think that we need to see the product of a planning process as something that doesn't just stay within the boundaries of those people that are going to act on the plan, but we use it as a means to build support and capitalize upon all the work that is done. And it's not something you want to take months and years to get out, because by that time the system has changed. So one of our working agreements is that the draft plan is produced, or the draft report is actually produced by the end of the workshop. Even though there may be additional work that needs to happen, it's important that it comes out, there's a draft working document that is ready to go at the end of the workshop. And lastly, the need for adaptation, both in terms of the plan itself, that although one might be developing a 10 or 15 or 30-year plan, the system changes too quickly, and uncertainty remains high for us to stay rigidly wedded to that plan throughout. So enabling the plan to building in review points and chances for tweaking or completely changing the plan at regular intervals is important. And also that relates to the planning process itself, and recognizing that the situation changes. For example, now the idea of bringing everyone together, sitting around a table to design a plan, seems quite alien, which 3 months ago it wouldn't have been. Now we're sitting around like we are now at the moment, looking at each other on screens. But we have to adapt to this environment, and we can't assume that the processes we developed before are going to be appropriate for now. And we're actually going through this at the moment, thinking about what do we need to do in order to develop the similar level of satisfaction from the planning process for participants as one might get if you were doing it in person. So these 7 principles: plan to act, promote inclusive participation, use sound science and best available information, good design neutral facilitation, decisions through consensus, generating and sharing, and adaptation, are the principles that we see as underpinning any planning process you use. And whether it's an established one or something you develop yourself, I think if you turn these principles into question marks and you use it as a guide throughout the process, and every now and again just ask yourself, how are we at the moment, are we being inclusive? Are we using the best available information? Are we experiencing neutral facilitation and good design? Can help you to kind of keep on track and ensure that you've got the best chance of producing an effective plan, and one that is implemented. And given the numbers of species that are out there that are on the verge of extinction, for which there is no plan in place, for which there's no plan in place, we need to scale up, and we need to not lose sight of the quality of the planning as we do so, in order to reverse current trends. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. We've got a few minutes left, and I think, Judy, when you had your, I'll actually stop sharing my screen. Actually, no, I won't. I'll just go to the full. Yeah, I will stop sharing my screen. And if you want to put your, you can put your hand up. I don't know, is it, whereabouts is it you put your hand up? I can't remember, can't remember how you do it. But anyway, whether it's turning your mic on or putting your hand up physically. Anybody got any thoughts, questions? Don. Go for it.
Well, I think what you're saying makes a lot of is common sense in dealing with in a lot of processes with a lot of people in a lot of different areas. And certainly in the field projects I've done in the past, or trying to get people to cooperate, say on giant anteater reproductive research in the 1980s, whatever, the consensus building and finding out who's important and who's not, with a limited collection of that species in zoos, etc. Getting their buy-in makes a big difference if you get one or two important people, all those things you covered. But the nice thing about this is that where a lot of us may have done this years ago, kind of feeling in the dark, when you do this planning process, bringing people together like you do systematically on different species throughout the world, I think that automatically sets the environment for all these processes that you've outlined here so effectively to take place a lot easier, a lot faster than it would be, you know, just kind of working on your own or working in a small group. So I see the advantage of your group as bringing people together in a format automatically where all these things are easier to take place. That's all.
Thank you, Don. And hopefully, we will keep on doing that, and we're going to need to do it more. What concerns me, particularly as my role is in capacity development, is that you know, we are the scale at which we can do it, the pace at which we can do it is far below what we need to achieve to really make a dent in the numbers of species which require effective plans in place. And so, you know, a question that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we scale it up? You know, how do we? And I think one of the reasons behind putting these principles onto paper is to try and also see alignment between how we might do things and how other groups might be doing things, and saying it doesn't matter whether you do use these sorts of tools and you do things in this sort of a way, that's fine. But if we all agree that these are the principles that underpin what you might do, then maybe we can move to a point of much greater collaboration, which is ironic. We should be collaborating so much. That's what one is promoting. But I think planning groups across the world should be working close together. And also we need to be thinking about how do we enable others to do this as well. And the challenge obviously comes is when you do care about the species, and you're the ones who are going to be the ones who will be wanting to turn, you know, these ideas into plans. And so how do we support you? Maybe it's through making connections between you and others that are nearby, who can help come in and facilitate maintaining neutrality. But somehow we've got to significantly scale up the rate at which we are able to produce plans and get them implemented. Any other thoughts or observations? Jim, and then Riley.
Oh, just really quick. I think one of the barriers is having these kinds of trainings. I do a bunch of stuff with open standards. Principles are very similar, but it's been very difficult to find training opportunities. So I do a bunch of them, but I'm just one person.
Yeah, well, I hope, in fact, I think, well, there are some people on here that I think are joining the online course we've got, which actually was developed slightly before we put shape to the principles, but hopefully you'll see resonance there, and that's going to help. But I think what I'd like to do is try and develop more of a network of people who have experience that can help bring on others as well, because you, like any of these things, you know, your ability is based around your experience, your competence, and your confidence in dealing with this complexity. Riley.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so I've been involved sort of tangentially in a couple of planning processes, and I've been at a couple workshops, not necessarily that were, you know, sort of structured in the way we've discussed here, but the bulk of my work has actually been in sort of the assessment phase, so red list assessments, so that one corner of the SSC triangle, so to speak, for species conservation that sorry, there's an airplane over my head right now.
I can hear you. Perfect.
I'm just wondering, we've discussed mostly about the planning and the acting portions of the species conservation, and I'm just wondering how you guys sort of interface that with the assessment and renewing assessments and you know, new information coming to light and maybe a species status changing in light of a new assessment.
Thanks for that. Actually, it gives me an opportunity to talk about this assess to plan process, which I don't know if you've come across, but it's something we've been working on for the last couple of years, where what often happens in red listing is that there's a focus on the development of the status information, but when it comes to look at conservation needs, and there's other areas as well, but there's the second section anyway within the red listing. It's definitely variable in terms of the quality and depth of content. And so over the last 18 months or so, we've been developing this assessed plan process that helps to deepen that part and actually identify planning pathways for groups of species. So there may be some species that, because of their shared threats or needs, could actually be planned for as a group. And for example, I'm doing some work just now with government of Morocco on planning for raptors, 12 species of raptor there, and actually the invertebrates in the Azores was also put through this process to identify that invasive plants were a key threat to all of those species. So we didn't need to look at them as individuals. We could actually plan for them as a whole group. And so the assess to plan identifies these planning pathways where groups of species can be passed through particular planning processes. They pass the baton from assessment through planning. There are going to be some species for which they need their own plan because of the complexity or the uniqueness about them. But for many, it's possible to group them. So that assess the plan process is one that's going to be talked more about and hopefully will help with making this connection between assessment and the planning. Okay, and if you want to know more about that, email me and I'll send you a link to what we've got. Rob.
So thank you. Yeah, I mean, just a brief comment on that. One of the, I think, really good examples that I'm aware of where groups of species have been lumped together is the fairly recent multi-species action plan for African and Asian and European vultures. So the vulture multi-species action plan. So it's well worth looking up that specific action plan on the internet. It's available, and that was a really good example that's fairly recently been developed for a group of species whose threats are fairly similar, at least at a sort of a continent level. So splitting them out into Africa and into Asia, where the threats are slightly different. So it's the CMS multi-species vulture action plan.
Thank you very much for that, Rob. I will definitely look at it because that will help me with this Moroccan work. Yeah, and I was thinking about reaching out to, is it Andre? I can't remember the chap who's the chair of the specialist group anyway, but that's great.
Andre Borcher.
Yes, great, thank you. Claire, did you have, hello again, did you have, are there any questions, observations, comments? Where we're slightly over time, we'll wrap up shortly. But.
Yeah, not necessarily. I was just thinking a little bit more about step 7, which is that adapt the process. And I know we've been struggling a little bit with getting teams. So we've been running projects, and then we go through this process of adapting the plan. And then often our teams just go back to sort of work as usual because that's what they're used to. And getting teams to sort of continue implementing the plan and the monitoring as we planned is really what I've been struggling with. So I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts about just maybe elaborating a little bit more on that step 7 and making sure that it's implemented as planned.
I could give you an illustration of that, which I don't know whether it's helpful or not, but I did some work with the people, the Scottish Natural Heritage, looking at Scottish wildcat conservation. And one thing that they did, so they had a plan that was running for definitely for 5 years, maybe 10 years or so, I can't remember now, number of years, and they got an external review done of the plan because they wanted to know how are we doing and do we need to change what we're doing. So they got the cat specialist group actually to come in and do what was really, really thorough review of the plan. They then got us in to help facilitate a workshop of the people involved in delivering on the existing plan, to say what do we think about this evaluation? How does it relate to our own understanding of the situation, and what are we going to do about it in the last 18 months or so of the planning process? And so what I think was good, the two things I thought that was good about what they did: A, they reached outside of the project to get some external reflection, but that does require the project to want to be open to that sort of that critique. But the next thing was to recognize that actually that changing the plan does require a revisiting of some of those planning processes, including taking people out of the day-to-day to look at to the future and say, what are we actually trying to achieve? Where are we now? And going through some of those planning steps they may have done if they were developing a 5 or 10-year plan. It may have been with a smaller group of people. It was over one day rather than 3 or 4. But it definitely seemed to be effective for that group, because they basically stripped out 4 or 5 of the populations they were looking at and focused in on one population and did all their work in the last year of the plan on that one population, which actually enabled the field teams to relax a lot more. They felt very happy about that because they were stretched very thin. But that was quite a significant shift in the plan to go from 6 down to 1 population they were going to focus on. And I think that the making time to bring everyone together, to look to the future, look at the present, going through that again, even though it was all people from there. It wasn't trying to bring in international experts or whatever. It was all people from within the team. But making time for that was necessary, I think, to enable them to be open to changing what they were doing. And it may well be, Claire, that's exactly what you do anyway. But I think if one is not encouraged to stand back and to look critically oneself, it doesn't matter what other people say, you're just as wedded to the way you're going as you would have been if there had been no plan put in place in the first place. Probably even more so, because you feel like you've already done the planning, so let's just carry on. We did all that participatory stuff back there. We don't need to do that again. Well, I think maybe you do, and a smaller scale, but I think you do need to make time for revisiting the whole system, because in that time, things have changed, new information's come out, new threats have arisen. So I think some cut down version of the whole planning process is actually one way anyway that you can facilitate that changing thinking.
Thanks, that's helpful.
I'm aware it's 25 past, so it's 10 minutes after the hour, so we probably should wrap up at that point. But thanks very much for for listening, for attending, and B, these principles. So the principles are not the steps. So don't think of them as one, I've got to do this, two, I've got to do that, now I've got to do this, now I've got to do that. They're all mixed in, but there are 7. These are the sort of the values, the core values that should underpin whatever you do. There are a series of steps we would say are useful, though you don't necessarily put them in the same order all the time, and that's separate. The principles with the steps is a document that we're putting together just now and will be published later on this year. But we just wanted to start talking about these principles, and I wanted to put this in at this point within the webinar series to say these are some of the things that we should care about when we're designing plans. And as we go forward over the next 6 months of webinars, and they're a monthly series, and if you're able to join, then fantastic. We should be keeping these in mind and thinking, how does this topic relate to these principles? And keeping these in mind, and whether we use open standards, CPSG, whatever it is, we feel strongly that they do resonate. They're nothing new. It's just trying to put some words to hopefully what we all believe, and that going forward we can all buy into. Some of you I think I will see on the online course. Others, if you have not attended the course and would like to, then please let me know and I can tell you when the next iteration will be. And I wish you all the best for this evening, or whatever point in the day you are. We'll put this recording on our website as well.
When's your next planning course?
The planning course will be, so there's actually one starting on the last week of August, but that group is we had a lot of applications for it, which is fantastic, but we've had to restrict it. So that one is full. And the next one will be we tend to run them in February and August each year. It's a 6-week course. So if you're interested, then if you put a note to contact me in December, which would be when I'll then be thinking about the exact dates for the next one, and just pop me an email. I'll multitask, I'm just putting my email in there anyway. Then I will let you know when it's coming out so that you can then get your application in.
Thank you.
Okay. And do look at the CPSG website. There's lots of other webinars there and other information linked to planning. So hopefully useful stuff for you all. I'll shut up now and let you all go.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Right, cheers. Bye for now.
Cheers. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.